Salem in October is Instagram perfect. Cobblestone streets, candlelit tours, pumpkin spice lattes in mittened hands. New Orleans is the same game with a different mask. Jazz spilling into the streets, powdered sugar on your lips, Mardi Gras beads swinging like relics from ancient balconies. It's charming, it's colourful, it's bullshit. You've entered Saints Occult. I'm Saint Ilyas, and if you're here, it's not by accident. Thanks for joining me. Tonight, we're pulling apart two cities that have been romanticised to death and then buried under layers of lies. Salem, the so-called witch city, where hysteria turned neighbour against neighbour. New Orleans, a city draped in music, mystery, and something far darker that refuses to stay in its grave. These places don't just share a reputation for the paranormal, they share something older, colder, and far more deliberate. And by the time you see the pattern, you'll understand why so many people vanished, and why nobody talks about them. Salem's Forgotten Shadows. Salem looks harmless in the day, even pretty, the kind of place where you could waste an afternoon staring at clapboard houses and not think twice. But if you stay past the tours, past the shop windows full of witch hats and pumpkin candles, you'll feel it. The ground feels old. Not just historic old, something else. This wasn't empty land before the Puritans came. The Namkeg people lived here. Buried here, they told stories about certain places you don't linger. Marshes that swallow sound, woods that go still without warning. The settlers called it superstition, but they avoided those places anyway. And then, the trials. Everyone talks about the trials, but the trials are just the bit of bone that poked through the skin. The real thing, the thing under it all, has been there longer. A few of the accused left scraps of writing, little notes that don't sound like church talk. Salt and smoke, doors without keys, not the sort of thing the ministers would have approved of. People stopped hanging witches, the headlines moved on. But the missing, they didn't stop, just slowed. A fisherman vanishes from his own boat, no splash, no overturned net. A girl disappears between her front gate and the church steps. Not many, one here, another there, always just enough time between them for folks to forget. Some families keep journals. They don't write gone or lost. They write offered. The voodoo veins of New Orleans. Magic's not tucked away here, it's in plain sight. But not all of it's for tourists. You've got your painted skulls, your fortune tellers, your bead-hung doors, and then you've got the other stuff, the chalk symbols that get washed away before morning, the jars tucked under porches, the coins and teeth left where the water runs slow. If you've never walked through a New Orleans cemetery, it's hard to explain. The first thing you notice is how open the dead are here. No neat rows of headstones, just avenues of marble houses, tall, ornate, sun-bleached, some crumbling under ivy. They call them cities of the dead because that's what they feel like. Whole neighbourhoods where the only residents don't breathe. The reason's practical, morbidly so. The city sits barely above the water table. Bury a coffin underground and sooner or later the floods will push it right back up. So they built vaults above the earth, stacking generations inside like chapters in a book. By law, families had to wait a year and a day before reopening a tomb, which meant the summer heat worked like a grim oven. In time, the bones of the dead mingled with those who came after. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is the most famous, partly because of who rests there, Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen. Even now, people leave offerings, coins, rum, cigarettes, scratching X's into the plaster in the hope she'll grant a wish. The city says you can be fined for defacing a tomb, but the marks still appear, sometimes fresh, sometimes in odd, deliberate patterns. Lafayette Cemetery No. 1 is quieter, shaded by live oaks whose roots curl under the crypts. It's older, a little more ragged. Tour guides talk about its beauty, but caretakers have their own stories. Of finding salt circles drawn at midnight, candles melted into deliberate shapes, and footprints in the dust inside locked tombs. No explanation, no witnesses. There's this old case from 1912, a dock worker named Etienne Laveau. Walked off the wharf after his shift, never walked back. They found his boots, side by side, like he'd taken them off to sleep. On the sole of one boot was a faint circle with a cross inside. You can see the same symbol scratched into a cellar wall in Salem, same year. That's the thing about New Orleans. Ghosts aren't just a story here, they're part of the landscape. Yellow fever once cut through the city like a scythe, killing thousands in weeks. The dead filled these cemeteries faster than the living could keep count. And as the Redditors point out, it wasn't ancient vampire lore that rooted here, it was the city's strange alchemy of death, ritual, and survival. That's why, when Anne Rice set her vampires in New Orleans, it felt like they'd always been here. The streets, the crypts, the river, everything was already primed for creatures that feed on life to hide in plain sight. And in a way, maybe that's the real spell of these cemeteries. They don't just hold the dead, they keep them in conversation with the living. And some conversations don't end. The Ritual Bridge. It's easy to think Salem and New Orleans have nothing in common. One's all New England chill, the other's swamp heat and brass bands. But if you start tracing the history, the lines connect. In the 1700s, trade routes linked the Northeast and the Gulf. Ships carried rum, molasses, and people. Enslaved Africans brought through the port of New Orleans. Indentured servants shipped up the coast. Sailors who'd seen more ports than they could count. Along with cargo came beliefs, folk magic, superstitions. The kind of things that survive in whispers and in the backs of notebooks. There's a record from 1731 of a merchant in Salem who was fined for unlawful assemblies. The details are vague, but one witness claimed to have seen strange marks drawn on the floorboards of his wharfside warehouse. Those marks match designs still used in Haitian Voodoo and West African religious systems, symbols meant to invite or protect against spirits. New Orleans Congo Square, in the 18th and 19th centuries, was a meeting place where enslaved Africans were allowed to gather on Sundays. They danced, drummed, and kept alive cultural practices that blended into the Voodoo tradition. Visitors from the north wrote about it, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with fear. A few of those visitors were Salem traders. There's even a 19th century shipping manifest listing a Salem vessel, the Mariner's Hope, making port in New Orleans 3 days before a documented disappearance in the city. The ship was back in Salem within a month, the same week a young dockhand vanished from Derby Wharf. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's a strange one. The hollow places. The disappearances never came in altogether. Salem's police archives note missing persons all through the 19th and 20th centuries. A labourer in 1884, a fisherman in 1909, a schoolteacher in 1952. The reports are clinical, just names, dates, last known sightings. New Orleans records are messier, floods destroyed some, hurricanes took others. But there are still cases. A cigar maker gone in 1897, a seamstress in 1924, a jazz musician in 1961. Sometimes the police reports mention odd details, clothes left neatly folded, strange carvings on door frames, wax drippings in places they didn't belong. Anthropologists studying Voodoo and Hoodoo traditions point out that certain rituals, particularly ones involving crossroads or water, have been known to symbolically send a person somewhere else, usually as part of spiritual initiation or offering. In most cases, it's metaphorical, but in the hands of someone with the wrong intent, symbols have a way of becoming more than symbols. As for Salem, folklorists argue that its missing cases fit into a broader New England pattern. Seafaring towns where superstition ran deep. Fishermen nailed horseshoes over their doors, buried iron nails under thresholds, left offerings by the tide. These weren't just for luck, they were payments, wards, promises to something they couldn't name. No court case, no confession, ever tied Salem and New Orleans together in writing, but the dates, the markings, and the quiet way the missing are remembered, or not remembered, leave an opening. The kind you might notice if you're standing in the wrong place on the wrong night. When the air goes still and the shadows deepen, and you realise you're the only one breathing. Some stories leave you with answers, this one doesn't. The police reports in Salem still use the same language they always have, missing. The New Orleans files are even barer, half lost to water and time. No one writes taken, no one writes offered. That language lives only in the margins, in a grandmother's memory, in a box of old letters, in the way someone pauses before walking down a certain street. If you put the maps side by side, Salem up here, New Orleans down there, the space between them looks empty, but trade routes once crossed it like veins. Ships made the trip in weeks. Beliefs made it faster. And if you think rituals can't travel, you've never seen a symbol scratched into a wharf in one city and painted on a wall in another, the same hand, the same intent, decades apart. You can argue that it's all coincidence, that disappearances happen everywhere, that symbols get reused, that patterns are just shapes our brains make so the dark feels less random. Maybe you're right. But if you're standing in Salem and the air feels heavy for no reason, if you're walking in New Orleans and the street ahead goes too quiet, don't stop, don't look back. Some rituals are about calling something in. Others are about making sure it doesn't notice you. I'm St. Ilyas, and this has been Saints Occult. The light deceives, the dark reveals. What other cities' buried stories should we dig up next? Until then, keep your eyes open and your back to the wall.